Listen, my mom works in an office, and I know all too well how it is. This isn't just content for sake of use, this story is based on real life experiences. The goal is for you to recognize yourself in it and not repeat other people's mistakes. All titles, names, and companies are fictional, but the meaning is more than real. This is what happens when you're underestimated.
The rain was still clinging to my coat when I walked into Kellen's office. 7:59 a.m., shoes still wet, eyes still burning from the red-eye flight back from our licensing negotiations in Chicago. The lights were already on. His coffee was still steaming, and his screen was already facing away from me as if I didn't deserve to see what he was typing. "Kellen," I started, but he didn't look up. Instead, he slid a manila envelope across the desk like a bar tab at closing time. "Your position no longer fits our direction," he said without inflection. "Security will walk you out." He hadn't even closed the Slack tab where I'd just uploaded the final documents that cleared our multi-state expansion, the package he'd been publicly attaching his name to for the last 6 weeks. My name wasn't on it. That was by design, because I've always believed power should whisper, not shout. And maybe that's why he thought he could do this. Maybe that's why he thought the woman who built the scaffolding of this company while he was still getting off book on our product names could be dismissed like a contractor who'd overstayed a deadline. He didn't smile, didn't blink, just tapped his pen against the desk like it was all routine. It wasn't. "Before we go further, take 1 second right now, tap subscribe, like the video if it already has your attention. Because 97% of people forget to do that, and it's the only way this kind of story gets told. Thanks. Now, back to it." I picked up the envelope slowly, peeled it open like it might bite, and slid out the termination paperwork. Everything was ready. My name, my employee ID, the predated timestamp. He'd made sure HR got ahead of it. Probably even timed it with his morning schedule. Fire by 8:03, smoothie by 8:30. As I scanned the pages, my eyes landed on the phrasing. "Due to organizational restructuring." That was rich. The only person who'd been restructuring anything was me, for 3 years. And I had receipts. Still, I didn't argue. I didn't flinch. I didn't even look at the small black dome in the corner of the ceiling where security was surely watching this unfold live. I just uncapped the pen, signed my name, and slid the document back across the desk. No emotion, no fight. Just quiet, measured acceptance. Then I stood. "You sure you want to do this?" I asked, not a threat, just a question. His eyes finally lifted from the screen. "Already did," he said. I nodded once. "Then let's make sure we do this properly." He blinked. That made him pause. Not long, just a half-second hiccup that told me he didn't know what that meant. And that was the moment the real story began. Because while he was rehearsing his little termination script in front of his hotel mirror last night, I was reviewing the operating agreement I wrote by hand 8 years ago. The one that never needed my name in bold to be binding. The one that hid power in plain sight. I walked out. Rain still falling, coat still damp, face unreadable. Security never even caught up. They didn't need to. I wasn't going anywhere, not really. Not when I still owned the room he thought he controlled. Not when the bylaws still answered to me. Not when 85% of the company belonged, quietly, legally, absolutely, to the woman he just tried to fire. And not when every board member was about to find out exactly how loud silence can get. 8 years ago, we didn't even have chairs that matched. The first conference room was an old repurposed break room with a printer that wheezed like it had asthma, and a coffee pot that leaked like a busted transmission. I still remember the smell of whiteboard markers and burned toast from the toaster we weren't technically allowed to have. The idea that this messy little startup might one day touch 8-figure contracts felt like science fiction. But I didn't care about fantasy. I cared about structure. About what would last when the glow of startup buzz wore off and the real work, the ugly, spreadsheet slogging, regulation wrestling work, started choking out everyone who thought charisma was a business model. So while the others were workshopping logos and investor decks, I was studying Delaware case law. I kept a legal pad under my pillow and a running list of governance clauses on the back of my phone case. I wasn't trying to look important. I was trying to make sure the day never came when someone could erase me with a headline. I was the one who brought in our first actual check, not venture, not family money, real earned capital, a small logistics firm out of Spokane that needed cross-border licensing help. I mapped it out, called the agencies, stitched it together, and sent the invoice. $22,000. We'd never seen that kind of cash. The founders high-fived. I opened QuickBooks and labeled it Client 01. When they offered me a title, I declined. Put it in equity, I said. They thought I meant 5%. I meant leverage, permanent binding leverage. I drafted the original operating agreement while everyone else was drunk off our first partnership demo. I buried the real language in the appendix, dilution clauses, veto rights, beneficial owner definitions tied to specific classes of silent shares. We were young, and nobody read the fine print. They trusted me, or they were too distracted. Maybe both. But I filed everything clean, signed, notarized, logged, and wrapped it inside a holding structure we'd formed as a vendor buffer for client risk. Cedar Row Holdings. It sounded like a quaint little management entity, a name we could put on invoices that looked boring enough to avoid scrutiny. I layered the ownership through 2 blind trusts. No one asked why. No one even thought to. And when we grew, when the investor money started circling like hawks looking for pre-IPO feathers to pluck, they only looked at the flashiest names on the cap table. No one ever traced the real stake. That's how I got to 85%. Not in one grab, but in increments. A slice here for covering payroll, another for backstopping legal. More when the seed investor pulled out and I quietly covered the vendor contracts to avoid default. Each time, I filed the paperwork. Each time, I wrote in the same clause. Cedar Row Holdings reserves the right of directional oversight in the event of executive-level restructuring. They thought it meant I'd help with transitions. They never realized it meant I owned the game board. And Kellen? Oh, Kellen. The man hadn't even read the governance documents he was so proudly wielding like a sword. He was brought in to be transformational. Fresh blood, fresh teeth. Fresh Harvard MBA, said he wanted to accelerate vertical synergies and unlock latent potential. Translation? Cut costs, fire anyone who wouldn't bow, and send screenshots of metrics to VCs between yacht photos. He never asked where Cedar Row's proxy votes came from. Never asked who had final say over directional shifts. Never questioned the dormant clauses I embedded like trap doors in the very structure he now stood on. He was so sure of the chair beneath him, he never looked to see if the floor had shifted. But I did. I was the one who built it. I took the long hallway out, didn't say goodbye to anyone, didn't look over my shoulder. The receptionist glanced up, probably waiting for me to break, to rage, to whisper something scathing under my breath. I just smiled once, flat and polite, and pushed through the double glass doors like someone late for lunch, not fresh off a professional execution. Kellen probably expected I'd email later, some indignant reply, a flurry of exit interviews and access requests. Or, better yet, nothing at all, just fade into irrelevance. That's how men like him survive. They count on the silence of the people they dismiss. But silence isn't surrender. It's signal. I got home, hung up my coat, and fed the dog like it was any other Tuesday. Because for me, it was. But for the company, it was the beginning of a recalibration that had been built into the bones of the bylaws since year 1. 2 tabs open on my laptop. One for the internal governance vault. One for the local notary who still took emergency appointments. The first document I pulled up was titled Provision 7B Executive Action Constraints, Material Decisions. It wasn't dramatic, just precise. A single paragraph that required notification and proxy review before any major restructuring event, including changes to executive leadership, the kind of thing everyone signs when they're desperate and barely skimming for keywords, but the one that bites when triggered. Next, I opened Provision 9F, Board Pre-Approval Gate on Directional Shifts. It had a simple purpose. If a majority shareholding block didn't expressly authorize a directional change, firing, hiring, divesting, merging, the action would be considered void until formally reviewed. Again, not a threat. A mechanism. I printed the forms, slid them into a folder marked with my initials, and headed to the notary. She didn't ask questions. Just stamped, signed, and handed them back with a quiet, "Good luck." I didn't need luck. I had leverage. Back at home, I uploaded the signed documents into the encrypted Cedar Row vault. Then, with the simplest act of all, I clicked the toggle labeled Activation, Governance Lockdown. It pinged our registered outside counsel with a timestamp. No need for flare, no need for flare. The system took over from there. Notifications went out automatically, one to the board, one to legal, and one to the internal governance review queue, flagged as high priority and immutable per the terms outlined in Appendix 4.2 of the operating agreement. You could almost hear the brakes screeching from across the city. Hiring, frozen, org chart updates, paused. Any planned announcement about my firing? Legally prohibited until governance review cleared the change. Kellen probably had a press-ready blurb locked and loaded by then. Something about strategic transformation and new horizons. Maybe a quote from a VC who owed him a favor. Now he'd be lucky to issue a parking validation without board sign-off. And that's what he never understood. Real power doesn't require shouting. It just requires documentation. I'd built every one of these provisions with the same philosophy I built the company. Quietly, precisely, legally. And tonight, for the first time in 8 years, they stirred. No noise, no warning, just a clean signature where it mattered most, and the quiet creak of a trapdoor finally swinging open. By Wednesday morning, the brakes screeched loud enough for everyone to hear, though no one dared say a word about them. It started as a whisper from legal, a low-priority email. Request for clarification, governance posture pending review. Then the automatic blocks kicked in. Hiring approvals bounced. Department heads found their restructuring memos tagged on hold awaiting control confirmation. Nobody knew what triggered it. No one wanted to admit they had no idea who had. By noon, legal escalated. They looped in outside counsel, the ones you only call when you need to use the phrases material exposure and fiduciary implications in the same sentence without blinking. Their response came swift and clinical. Freeze all executive actions pending verification of beneficial control. Simple, surgical, final. No org chart changes, no press releases, no offers extended, no titles changed, no LinkedIn promotions fired off under cover of night. Just stop. Everything. And for a company that had been running full tilt under Kellen's visionary transformation for 6 weeks, the sudden stillness felt radioactive. He didn't take it well. Thursday morning, he barged into the boardroom mid-call, phone still pressed to his ear like a prop. His suit was too crisp, like he'd doubled down on presentation to hide the cracks in control. "This is obstruction," he snapped, dropping into a chair uninvited. "We need to override the stop directive. This paralyzes our momentum." Nobody moved. Not the chairman, not the investor rep, not the corporate secretary who kept her pen frozen mid-note like she was afraid even writing might violate something. Because 20 minutes earlier, each of them had received an email with no greeting, no body text, just a locked PDF titled Beneficial Ownership and Control Review, Cedar Row Holdings. The file opened to a single cover page, one line center-aligned. As of last certified update, controlling interest equals 85.4%. Class A shares, held via Cedar Row Holdings, entity of record per Section 3.4 of the operating agreement. Below that, my initials, not as an employee, as the beneficial owner. And while they all stared at that one immutable truth, Kellen was still pitching excuses like it was just a temporary delay, like he was the victim of bureaucratic overreach instead of the architect of his own detonation. "Look," he said, gesturing to his slide deck like any of them cared. "I have commitments. We told investors we were initiating phase 2. We're already positioned for the rollout. This kind of governance bottleneck is dangerous. It creates noise, doubt. We're sending the wrong signal." The chairman finally spoke. Quiet, measured, voice lined with the tone of someone who's just realized they're sitting in the wrong chair in the wrong meeting. "We've received documentation indicating that a controlling interest has reasserted procedural oversight," he said. "We're obligated to verify compliance before any action proceeds." "That's ridiculous," Kellen hissed. "Controlling interest from who?" But the answer was already in their inbox. He just hadn't connected the name, hadn't bothered to ask who or what Cedar Row really was. I had. For years. That document, just one page, did what no speech could. It turned a room of executives into statues. It took a man who thought he held the keys and showed him the vault door was never his to open. He stood, fists tight, eyes darting, searching for someone, anyone to back him up. But everyone in that room knew what silence sounds like when power shifts. No one argued, no one comforted, no one moved. The brakes weren't just applied, they were locked. And Kellen, for the first time, looked like a man starting to understand he was driving someone else's car, with someone else's name on the title. The call came just after sunset. Blocked number, no voicemail. I let it ring out the first time. Let him sit in whatever version of realization was washing over him. It rang again, 2 minutes later. This time I answered. Not out of urgency, out of courtesy. He'd earned that much by finally recognizing the room he thought he owned had a foundation he never questioned. There was a pause before he spoke. Breathing, gathering, and then, I wasn't aware. That's all he managed before I cut in. You weren't supposed to be, I said evenly. Another pause, longer this time. I could almost hear the whiteboard equations crashing down in his head, the dotted lines between Kellen's charisma and our voting structure dissolving like dry ink in the rain. When men like him get nervous, they reach for structure. So that's what he did next. I believe we'll need a special session, he said, trying to keep the authority in his voice. Soon, before anything else becomes complicated. Monday, I replied. 9 a.m., I'll circulate the proxy tonight. He agreed, quickly, too quickly. That's when I knew the board had already started asking questions he couldn't answer. Questions like, who actually owns the decision we just followed? And why weren't we looped in sooner? I ended the call without ceremony. No threat, no promise, just silence. Then I opened the folder labeled Governance Activation, Emergency Session. It had lived on my desktop for 6 years. Inside, everything they'd need to verify authority. My beneficial ownership certificate, tied to Cedar Row Holdings. The layered trust documentation, clean and current. The original operating agreement with every clause annotated and bookmarked. A copy of the cap table as amended, time-stamped and board-filed. And a notarized proxy packet giving me the right to vote in absentia should they attempt to maneuver around a quorum. I signed every line, double-checked each attachment, then sent it as a single locked PDF with a cover message written in one line only. Let's confirm governance compliance before we create additional exposure. No threats, just inevitability, because once the lawyers saw those documents, they'd know the truth. Nothing Kellen had done in the past 48 hours was compliant. Not his memos, not his terminations, not his hiring roadmap. And certainly not the forced deletion of the person who legally held directional control over the firm. That email wasn't a power grab. It was a mirror. I wasn't raising my voice. I was handing them the receipts. And the thing about receipts is they don't care how confident you sounded in the pitch deck. They just say what happened, on record, in ink. Monday morning, the board would gather. Some of them would try to rationalize, some would stay silent and let the tide pull the mess downstream, and some would start backing away from Kellen like he was already radioactive. Didn't matter, because the only thing left to confirm was what they should have seen from the start, that I was never just a name on the old payroll list. I was the spine they'd overlooked. And now that the company was standing without it, they were about to feel just how brittle the rest of it really was. Kellen showed up 10 minutes early. Dark suit, fresh shave, new cufflinks that still had the plastic backing on them, like he'd bought them that morning thinking today was his big save the company moment. He walked into the boardroom like a man about to give a TED Talk, not a man seconds away from losing everything he thought he controlled. The room was quiet. Not tense, just restrained. Like everyone was waiting for the moment someone else would say what they were all already thinking. He sat at the head of the table, fingers laced like he was preparing to deliver a eulogy for a stranger. I watched from the second row, proxy in hand, not present to argue, just to observe. You learn a lot when you let other people talk first. The chairman opened the session by clearing his throat once, not for effect, more like he'd swallowed something sour and couldn't quite spit it out. We've received updated documentation regarding voting control, he said, gaze locked on the printed packet in front of him. No theatrics, no apology. He flipped a page, read the figures aloud like they were line items from a grocery list. Cedar Row Holdings, 85.4% of Class A voting shares. Proxy certified, notarized. He paused, just long enough to let the sentence finish echoing around the room. Then he looked at Kellen. Direct, impersonal, like a bank teller explaining an overdraft. In light of Ms. Denner's controlling interest, the chairman said, "We'll proceed with a vote of confidence." Kellen blinked. Once. Twice. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. He looked around, waiting for someone to speak on his behalf. No one did. The investor representative was staring at his tablet like it might hold the answer to a test he hadn't studied for. The HR director, one of Kellen's early champions, wouldn't even meet his eyes. The general counsel simply sat still, hands folded, lips pursed like a man silently calculating severance language in real time. 9 votes, 1 abstention. The chairman didn't even bother calling for debate. He just raised the gavel, an old walnut thing that had once belonged to our first board chair, and brought it down with a single clean knock. Motion carried. Mr. Darnell is removed as Chief Executive Officer, effective immediately. No yelling, no outbursts, no rescue attempt. Just air leaving the room and the sound of Kellen's breath catching in his throat. He didn't stand. Didn't protest. He just sat there, spine wilting in inches, staring down at the table like it might tell him what just happened. But it was over. Not with a scandal, not with a headline, just with the dry procedural cadence of consequence. I didn't smile, I didn't gloat, I just watched. Because there was nothing to celebrate. I hadn't come back to prove a point. I'd come to restore order, to clean up the mess someone made while playing king in a castle he never read the deed for. And now, with the gavel dropped and the chair empty, the room finally felt the weight of what had been there all along. Quiet power, paper leverage, and the truth no one could unsee. You don't need to raise your voice when your name's already on the title page. I didn't sit in his chair. Didn't need to. After the vote, the boardroom emptied fast, like everyone was eager to pretend they hadn't just watched a CEO get erased in under 3 minutes. Kellen lingered behind for a moment, gathering the pieces of his shattered self-image into a leather briefcase he no longer deserved. He didn't look at me, just walked out slower than he'd walked in, like the room itself had betrayed him. The chair stayed empty. I left it that way, because this wasn't about reclaiming a title I never needed to validate my role. It was about stabilizing something that mattered more than optics. And the first step was installing someone who understood the difference between control and care. Her name was Mara Kellis, former COO of a logistics tech firm we'd partnered with years ago. Quiet operator, zero flash, built like ballast. She read contracts line by line, didn't perform, didn't posture. She'd once halted a $12 deal over a missing compliance signature and said, "We don't gamble with foundations." I liked that, so I called her. 1 meeting, no sales pitch. I just slid the documents across the table and said, "We need 6 months of clean air. Can you give me that?" She nodded once and said, "If I have full discretion, yes." She did. Within 3 days of her appointment, the panic started to thin. Departments exhaled. The reorg was suspended. Calendars stopped shifting like tectonic plates. She met quietly with every team lead. No ego, no entourage. Just a pen, a notebook, and a direct question. What do you need to do your job better? People blinked at first. They weren't used to being asked, especially not after 6 weeks of fire drill leadership and slide deck psychobabble about agile transformations and post-pyramid structures. Vendors who'd gone silent began replying again. 2 reached out directly to me saying, "If this is the new direction, we're back on board." A key European licensing partner who had paused negotiations under Kellen's leadership reinitiated talks, citing restored confidence in internal continuity. That was the phrase that stuck. Restored confidence in internal continuity. No headlines, no interviews, no strutting across LinkedIn like we'd reinvented business. Just systems returning to rhythm, just decisions made without vanity. Inside the building, the change was more subtle, but more important. Where before there had been frantic Slack threads full of vague jargon and pressure-drenched 9 p.m. check-ins, there was now structure, actual clarity, boundaries, and the whispers? They started again. But this time, they weren't the hushed kind of back-channel gossip that made people flinch when doors closed. They were quieter, warmer, like reverence spoken sideways. I heard someone refer to Mara as a grown-up in the cockpit, Someone else said, "Feels like we're finally building again, not just surviving someone's resume." And once, walking past the design team's corner pod, I caught a sentence that stopped me in my tracks. "She's not coming to take over. She's here to keep us from tipping over." They didn't know I'd heard. Didn't know the difference that made, but I did. Because that's what true ownership is. Not climbing back into the spotlight, but building the stage so others can stand without it collapsing. No desk, no title. Just the hum of things finally working again. And that was enough. The rain had stopped that morning, just enough to leave a gleam on the sidewalk. Seattle's version of a blessing. I pulled my coat tighter, nodded at the security guard out front, and stepped through the front doors like I had 1,000 times before. Only this time, there was no badge, no agenda, no pressure, just purpose. No one announced me, no one needed to. The lobby felt quieter now, not hushed, just settled, like the chaos had burned itself out and what remained was ready to be rebuilt. I didn't pause at the welcome desk, didn't scan the walls for familiar faces. I simply nodded once to the receptionist. New girl, probably didn't know my name, just smiled like she could sense I wasn't a visitor. I took the stairs. 3 flights, not because the elevator was slow, but because I wanted the time. To feel the space again. Hear the echoes I used to ignore when everything moved too fast to notice them. The conference floor hadn't changed much. Same sterile lighting, same air that always ran a little too cold. Like the building wasn't sure what season it wanted to belong to. I walked into the executive room at 8:57 a.m. 3 people glanced up. One of them was Robert. 6 weeks ago, he was the one who'd stood beside security as they walked me out, clipboard in hand like he was checking boxes off a fire drill. He wasn't cruel, just complicit. The kind of man who moved whichever way the wind was gusting that quarter. A survivalist in a suit. He stood when he saw me now. "Ms. Denner, he began, voice cracking under the weight of something he probably hadn't even named yet. I raised one hand, gently. "Let's move forward," I said, then walked past him, pulled out the chair at the far end and sat. No vindication speech, no pointed looks, no subtle theatrics of return. Just the sound of the clock striking 9 and the meeting beginning right on time. Mara was already seated at the head. She gave a small nod in my direction, then turned back to the room. "We'll start with operations. Brad, you're up." The transition was seamless. No tension, no side glances, no room for the past to sneak in. Because when the structure is sound, it doesn't matter who's watching. It just works. I sat quietly through the updates, made a few notes, asked one question, offered one correction, didn't raise my voice, didn't need to. Halfway through the financials, the mood shifted. Not because of what was said, but because I was there, because I wasn't a rumor anymore. I wasn't a ghost at the edge of a board meeting. I wasn't someone they'd watched get erased and wondered if she'd ever reappear. I was present and real, and still holding the ground they once tried to pretend I didn't own. After the session, someone offered coffee. I declined. Said I had another meeting, and I did. Across town, with a policy partner who'd waited out the Kellen era in silence, knowing better than to stake good work on bad leadership. That meeting would go well. I already knew. But in that room, at that table, with a residue of past betrayals still faint on the furniture, I had nothing left to prove. The desk wasn't mine, but the direction was, and no one, not a single person, asked who was in charge, because they already knew. 3 months passed. The company moved forward, without drama, without spectacle. Mara transitioned from interim to permanent CEO with unanimous board support. Operations stabilized, revenue climbed. Our international partners, once jittery from Kellen's whiplash decisions, recommitted with new, firmer terms. Not out of fear, out of trust. And me? I stepped further back. Quietly. Deliberately. My oversight became a quarterly pulse, not a daily presence. That was the point of the structure I'd built, to ensure the business didn't depend on noise, ego, or adrenaline to survive. Just clarity, discipline, ownership. It was on a rainy Thursday when the message came through. A ping from someone I hadn't heard from since the vote. Just a link. Kellen's LinkedIn. Excited to advise founders on strategic exits and leadership transformation, the post read. Looking to help next-gen leaders avoid common scaling mistakes and drive lasting change. The photo was cropped just right. Tight suit, bookcase behind him, chin lifted like he was auditioning for a podcast no one asked to host. I stared at it for a long second, not out of anger, not even disbelief, just study. The way you might look at an old fracture on an x-ray, remembering how it happened, but no longer feeling the break. And then I saw it. A single comment, buried halfway down the thread, already half muted by the algorithm, from one of our board members, the one who'd watched it all unfold from the first moment he received the Cedar Row file. It read, "Start by reading your own bylaws next time." No exclamation, no venom, just a scalpel pressed flat to the page. I didn't react, didn't share it, didn't screenshot it for friends or fire off a wry response. I just closed the tab, because the point had already landed. Not on him. Kellen would spin whatever story helped him sleep, but on everyone else watching. The investors, the analysts, the clients who had once taken his word as gospel. Now they had context. They remembered the freeze, the silence, the sudden course correction. And that comment, sitting quietly under his self-appointed rebirth, whispered a truth they wouldn't forget. He thought he was firing a middle manager. He was eliminating his boss.